So the last two Sundays we've looked at Easter, we've looked at the cross, we've looked at Jesus, and found a God who is with us forever, a God of love and truth and grace, a shepherd who leads us safely, and we are called to follow. It begs the question, how do we respond to the Easter story? Now, this isn't new. It obviously comes up every year. Again, the lectionary guides us on this journey through the season of Easter. Our focus is directed towards the disciple Simon Peter, from whom we have heard over the past weeks as he addressed a crowd of devout Jews from every nation under heaven in the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. It took a while for Peter to get here, but after seeing the empty tomb, after hearing Mary's testimony to the risen Jesus and Cleopas' report of his encounter on the road to Emmaus, after then himself meeting Jesus in the upper room twice and being shown Jesus' hands inside and being told, "As my Father sent me, so I send you," Peter finally gets it. And how? He has the courage to front such a large and diverse gathering and proclaim Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection as the work of God and as evidence that Jesus is Lord and Messiah, not only as an historical fact, but as a reality meaningful to him and Jesus' followers. Identifying Jesus with God, he quotes the Psalms, "The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. I keep the Lord always before me." Those have been our readings over the past 2 weeks in Acts. As we read on, we see the results. His witness inspires thousands to join the movement and form the nascent church, which spreads from Jerusalem throughout the known world. Having travelled the same path over the weeks of Easter, because Jesus' injunction to his followers in that upper room remains Jesus' injunction to his followers down the ages. That's why we need to travel this path. Jesus says to us too, "As my Father sent me, so I send you." We too are sent. What does this mean for us? In the first letter of Peter to the growing churches in Asia Minor, we can glean insight into how to bear witness to Jesus as Lord and Messiah, and to the true face of God, a God of love and truth and grace. Now, 1 Peter is a genuine letter, but probably not written by Simon Peter, who was addressing the crowd in our reading from Acts. It represents a combination of Pauline and Petrine traditions within the early church in Rome at the end of the first century after the death of Peter. It's set forth in Peter's name to claim that its teaching represents the apostolic faith that was supporting the church. This is its foundation as a pastoral letter to churches struggling in Asia Minor in a very difficult situation. The members of these churches once participated in the normal social and cultural life of their communities, but since their conversion to Christ, they have become marginalised and abused. The society to which they once belonged now considers them an unwelcome, even dangerous sectarian movement. Their abuse appears mostly verbal, and there's no overt government persecution. First, Peter offers realistic encouragement and instruction to Christians attempting to live faithfully in such a situation. The letter is intended to guide decision from the readers, how to respond to the revelations and realities of the Easter story. And while our situation may seem on the face of it worlds and eons away from the early Christians in Asia Minor, perhaps there are some resonances that would suggest we might also benefit from hearing from this letter how we might respond to Christ's sending into our world. Our world. There's no doubt that the social standing of the organised church has changed over the past decades. We're not persecuted, but perhaps more likely to be looked on askance in response to past and even some present reprehensible behaviours within churches that identify as Christian. The organised church may be more open to public criticism and even ridicule, for example, in some comedy situations. Disbelief is regarded as more sensible and intelligent in many circles. This parallels a decline in adherence to Christianity in its many denominations. Sequential census results show continuous falls in the proportion of people who identify as Christian, from 61 to 44% in a decade, with concomitant increase from 22 to 39% of those reporting no religion. Our National Church Life Survey results echo this trend, with falling church attendances and, for the most part, ageing congregations. As a consequence, it can be tempting to identify as the underdog, as some Christian groups are choosing to do. Several opinion pieces in the media over Easter reported how parts of the organised church have taken on a sort of victimhood from these data and attitudes of the public, presenting themselves as persecuted minority fighting for the rights to religious freedom. This is problematic in several ways. Firstly, and unlike the early Christians we read about in Peter's letter, very often these victims are hardly powerless or without a voice. Their emphasis is on being the kind of victim who is being attacked by anti-God forces and therefore strives for victory in the political and moral realms. Such a worldview assumes the world is a battlefield and God is on their side in a righteous crusade. It fails to acknowledge others outside this specific devout group who are vulnerable or oppressed. Such a perspective seeks victory for itself. Secondly, the religious freedoms they want to fight for tend to involve curtailing the rights and status of others, especially marginal groups who are beginning to attain equity. A sad but very pertinent example was played out in the media last week. There was an opinion piece by a young man, the captain of a church-based grammar school, where he points to Jesus' life to guide him in being a model of Christian living in response to his church's assertion that as a gay young man he is not fit for school leadership. He said, "The Christian faith is built on the example of Christ set in his life, his revolutionary compassion, so radical then as it still is now, care for the outcasts, the lepers, the unclean, inform the values of Christianity. His revolutionary compassion informs the values of Christianity and directs the moral constitution of the church. Jesus shocked the established powers of his time. His love, a love we have focused on deeply over the past 2 weeks, his love is the instrument of a legacy which left a world faith developing in its wake." Sadly, in the same media, we also had this response from an Anglican minister in Sydney. "The Christian faith rests more on the gift that Jesus gave than the example that Jesus set. The gift was the sacrifice of his life, so that whatever we have done, we can be forgiven and set free, i.e. penal substitutionary atonement, which I talked about a couple of weeks back. This minister is arguing we should focus our call to discipleship on less than 2% of Jesus' life if we consider the day of his death as a proportion of his ministry since his baptism in the Jordan, or just 0.02% of the life of the second person of the Trinity incarnate as God with us." I think we probably in this parish focus on all of Jesus, all of the second person of the Trinity. Outside the church, as another perspective, our society's values and behaviours can be frankly antagonistic and offensive to the God we've been talking about, the God of love and truth and grace, who is also the Creator God. How do we be Jesus followers in a society where we know there is exploitation of persons and nature for wealth generation for the already rich, where the oldest living culture on earth is disdained and hurt, with some wishing to deny them a voice to articulate their way forward, where vulnerable people seeking safety on our shores are refused security and safety, where prejudice, misogyny, race hatred, homophobia, xenophobia, transphobia are manifest in our media almost daily. In such a society, should we not be more on the margins? Might we not aspire to being an unwelcome movement that challenges the status quo? So as we look at how the early church is called to respond to the extraordinary good news of the love and grace of God personified in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we must tread a careful path. We must prepare our minds for action. We must discipline ourselves and carefully assess our goals, those things on which we set our minds, to align with God as revealed in Jesus' death and resurrection. In Peter's letter, if we listen, we are called to be holy, hagios, meaning separate from the common condition, dedicated. We are a chosen race, God's own people, in order to proclaim God's holy acts, God's love, God's staying with us through everything, whatever befall. This is hard. And the following passage from Peter that we will hear next week makes it perhaps harder still. I'm going to talk about it and it might resonate with you as you think of it next week. In it we're urged as aliens and exiles to behave honourably, to earn respect and model goodness, and to accept the authority of every human institution. And in the times of writing this epistle, many of those social structures are now anathema, though not perhaps as extinct as we might wish. It's a fine line between holding human institutions to account and accepting their authority, between challenging and fighting, between overturning tables in the temple and refusing violent defence to the extent of healing the injury caused by such violence. Yet we are called to walk this fine line. Some of the best advice I've heard about how to do this came from a talk some years back by John Dixon, co-founder of the Centre for Public Christianity and previous assistant minister at St Andrew's Anglican Church in Roseville. He pointed to the first letter of Peter that we have been reading, but a chapter that is a bit further on it that we will not touch on. So I'm going to bring it up today. But he's still talking about the challenge that we face in chapter 3, verse 15. The challenge not to be intimidated, but to always be ready to make your defence to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Why do you go to church? We need to be ready and willing to talk about and even defend our faith. The crunch line, he said, comes next in verse 16, which he quoted first in Greek, and for John, I'm going to do the same. I won't ask you to translate. Alla metaprates kai phobos. Always be willing to make your defence to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Dixon does not want, he says, to see a false dichotomy between the courageous Christian, who is a bit of a meanie, and the sweet, gentle Christian who never sticks their head above the parapet. What we really need is courage and gentleness together. And fortunately in Australia, we have so many safe ways to promote Christ's message without anger, disdain, or even real contention. Just courage and gentleness. This leads us to the insights that John offered on Easter Day, that we share our lives for people to see Jesus, that we acknowledge God's presence in us, recognise it and foster it, that this enlivens the power of the Holy Spirit in us to be God's hands and feet. As we practice the presence of God, we become the presence of God. But always, alla metaprates kai phobos, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Amen.